The kinds of climate-related projects that are best suited for public-private partnerships are ones where there is a clear role for the private sector and also a clear role for government. Now we're seeing increasingly that there's gray area in there as we look outside the box, the conventional PPP box, for solutions. But typically what we want to see is that for the private sector, there is a service or a product that is climate friendly, whether it's mitigation, adaptation, resilience, that can generate an acceptable rate of return. So these don't have to be conventional rates of return. They don't have to be in the 20s, 20% IRR, for example. They may be in the single digits as a rate of return, something that you might more typically see for a bond issue. But for a variety of reasons, a bond issue is not the right mechanism for the partnership, and there is a need for some innovative back and forth between government and private sector on how to make things work. Typically, we see in public-private partnerships two broad kinds of partnerships. The more traditional PPP is often around a specific piece of infrastructure or a specific service. So, for example, an area of land that is being restored, or maybe a large agricultural project that is restoration-based, or even a wind project, for example. So that is relatively straightforward in that you have a defined area, a relatively defined set of stakeholders. What I find really interesting in PPPs now with climate finance is that there's another area of collaboration, and that is, again, pushing outside of the box for those additional solutions we need to meet our climate finance gap, and looking at how can government and the private sector working together enable many SMEs, small to medium enterprises, come up that can provide solutions in areas like e-mobility, where perhaps there is not a single technology, it's not wind, it's not a single technology that's being selected, but rather a let's let many flowers bloom type of approach, or as one CEO I used to work for in the US used to put it, many wagons west. Because we're not quite sure what the right solution is, but we're looking for those solutions. We know the private sector has to be part of it, and the government has to collaborate and cooperate to create that enabling environment, but they're not quite sure right now what that enabling environment needs to be. And that's where P4G and the Finance Center can provide that great kind of mapping, stakeholder mapping, as well as that ongoing support to help government and private sector work together at that intersection to figure out what's going to work. So I'll give an example for this since I mentioned e-mobility. P4G, which is a platform within WRI's Finance Center, is working on e-mobility in Colombia and Kenya in particular, where we have multiple private sector partners that are coming up with e-mobility solutions that range from two-wheelers like bikes and motorbikes to three-wheelers like tuk-tuks, all the way up to buses, looking at electric buses, green hydrogen buses, etc. And what we're finding is that as we work collaboratively in Kenya, as an example, with P4G's national platform partner, which is the government of Kenya through the Ministry of Finance and Trade, I'll have to check on that, so please cut that. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. As we work with multiple e-mobility partnerships there, and we are working with government on dialogue with those multiple partnerships, what we're finding is that each partnership is identifying different specific things that can help their enabling environment, help their business case. And when businesses in climate are often working with very fine margins, very low margins. And so small things like changes in a tariff, changes in import restrictions can have a real impact on the success or failure of these projects. And the government can learn from one private sector entity, but then apply that learning to create an enabling environment for other private sector entities. Yeah, so why are some partnerships more suited than others to climate finance? And this is an interesting question, and I think we're going to see a lot of change in the coming years about how we think about public-private partnerships in this space, because there is such a huge gap to get from where we are today to the level of public and private work and the level of financial flows coming into that work in the future. And so it used to be that public-private partnerships, there would be a relatively clear role for each stakeholder. Now, typically for a PPP, that relatively clear role evolves over time, and it takes a lot of stakeholder building to get to that point. A lot of dialogues, design charrettes, things like this that help stakeholders come together. What really works in a public-private partnership is where there is a specific opportunity that is being sought around a specific business, where there is a specific business case with numbers that is being proven out, and where that model, that business model, and the financial numbers underlying it are shared and understood by all stakeholders, such that the government can consider, okay, if we make a change in, say, our tariff for electric vehicle battery charging, if we make that a preferential tariff, they can understand both what the impacts are for the business model of that battery owner or that battery service provider, as well as what the impacts are for then the grid operator who has to live with that reduced tariff. And this is the kind of collaboration back and forth that is needed in order to make climate finance work. Yeah, so in climate finance public-private partnerships, there is risk assumed by both parties, and that's often why there's a PPP, because there is a high risk and a low margin, and often because traditional solutions aren't working, and traditional finance cannot come in to this space or has not come into this space. So the challenges for the private sector are typically, the risks for the private sector are typically around, will the government default? Will the government stop allowing certain subsidies? Will they stop being able to pay or change their policy to pay for the services that are being provided? Now, typically there are agreements signed that help to prevent this, but of course with government change and force majeure, there's always uncertainty, there's always the perception of risk. For the public sector, the risk can be around the success or failure of the project. Does the private sector partner, or partners, usually there's multiple partners, working with civil society partners, do they have the right design, the right model to work both on that for-profit side and the community side, typically with the community involved in those environmental and climate benefits, to make the project a success? Because that's what the government is investing in. And that is, from a constituency standpoint, what they want to see. So that's a real risk there. And I think one of the great opportunities that the kind of mapping that the Finance Center is providing, and the kind of financial connections and financial options and mechanisms, is it helps to navigate that pathway both for government and for the private sector. Yeah, so when we talk about stakeholders and public-private partnerships, to make a list is almost to invite errors of omission, because a truly successful public-private partnership involves a lot of stakeholders. It all depends on the kind of public-private partnership. large public-private partnerships, such as wind farms, have traditionally really been challenged when it comes to stakeholder involvement, and I think there's been lots of positive learning that brings out the importance of involving the community, and the community being not only the individuals, but also the community government and the NGOs that often act as intermediaries there. In different countries, there are different layers of government that have to be understood and navigated. And if a public partner comes in from a different country, that can be difficult to navigate and therefore important to engage with the right in-country local stakeholders to understand. From the government side, it's also really important to engage not just at that community level, but then to go up the tiers of government to get to national level, because that's where we're seeing the greatest success in public-private partnerships, of course, is where they're aligned with government priorities. So when it comes to public-private partnerships for climate finance, those NDCs are a great way for stakeholders to come in and identify areas where there's greater traction, and then working with those offices help to map out the stakeholders that should be involved in the partnership. There are many challenges in creating a PPP, particularly in climate finance. One of the first challenges is, in fact, understanding the network, understanding the stakeholders that you have to engage with in country, both public and private. And additionally, understanding the stakeholders to engage with at a global level, because successful PPPs engage and make that connection from the global to the local to enable those in-country transitions, but to also attract the financing needed to enable those in-country transitions. And so where we see the greatest successes in our public-private partnerships is where there is an executive team or a leadership team of that partnership. And so typically it's not a leadership team from any one organization, it's the leaders from multiple organizations coming in that have a network that enables them to navigate that environment, to navigate through the many challenges that occur in developing a PPP. On the point of the many challenges that occur in a PPP, what we have seen is that successful partnerships have an ability to navigate and be flexible and change their assumptions and change their approach when they found one avenue of approach is not going to be successful. And this is critical for all of our partnerships. I'd say our successful partnerships have had to go through 2 or 3 or 4 different iterations of how they thought they could get from the initial coalition to a level of coalition that brings in financing and brings in the stakeholders and the buy-in and the level of confidence needed in order to make the project successful. So that leads me to another key aspect in challenges, which is the tolerance and ability to focus and essentially stick with it, that level of grit and tenacity that's needed in order to make these partnerships successful, because they often take a number of years really to pull together. And so this is where the leadership teams of partnerships need to have that kind of grit, that kind of tenacity, and that kind of flexibility that allows them to adapt and adjust to the changing situation and hopefully to realize success, often not through the original avenue and vision, but through the avenues that have proven successful. On the question of how countries can improve the bankability of their climate partnerships, there are a couple of pathways, I think, to success, And many of those are guided by the great work that the Finance Center at WRI is doing to help map out what are the options for finance and how that finance can be connected from the global level to the in-country level. And where countries are able to provide that single point of entry for public-private partnerships, where there can be that collaboration, where they have a group within a ministry and a trade association usually working together, in our experience, that can help these partnerships to navigate the complex environment of climate finance, where countries want to be checking the box on their NDCs, and where the financiers who are coming in also want to be checking the box on the SDGs and the NDCs that they are compliant with. And so being able to match those up is, I think, a key competitive differentiator that countries can provide or use to enable partnerships. Another area where I think countries can work to enable climate finance is by looking at their public policy and regulatory environment and having the right dialogue or dialogues with the private sector to enable learning. So if it comes to electric vehicles, and should tariffs be modified for electric vehicles, where they can have that dialogue and enable that exchange of information back and forth, and then have also the technical assistance to come in and look at the rate case for the public utility, as well as then looking at the financial model for the business. So focusing on that enabling environment and understanding that there is not one or two or three changes that have to occur and then check the box, it's fixed, but that it's really going to be a continuous process of evolving and changing regulation to meet climate finance needs. Another point on improving the bankability of projects is that what we've seen is where there are end-to-end mechanisms that help partnerships through the planning process, all the way through the fundraising, and then the actual execution of the project. That is really essential, because there's not success until the project is actually executed and completed, and these projects tend to operate for multiple years. And so really there needs to be those end-to-end facilities that can help throughout that, both with the public and the private stakeholders, to continue to learn and bring that learning back into the climate finance arena to say, okay, how can we do the next partnership better? How can we arrange for the next tranche of funding or the next fund structure to be modified according to what we have learned in the most recent? So those kinds of end-to-end facilities can really be critical for that. Yeah, absolutely. It's important for two reasons. One, because there is a tremendous entrepreneurial potential out there in all of these countries where climate transitions are needed. And that entrepreneurial potential is difficult for climate finance for climate financiers who are often sitting in international offices in London, in New York, etc., to then be connected to and to know how real or tangible they are. And so this is where the end-to-end facilities can come in and help build up those, well, first help identify those entrepreneurs and help build those entrepreneurs to a level where they're able to make a solid business case, where they're able to prepare financial pro formas and have a discussion with an investor. And then to bring them to these events is an opportunity to showcase them to these large offices that may be sitting in London, in New York, in Paris, in Geneva, that are interested in finding these deals but don't have the resourcing or the manpower to get out in every single country and at the grassroots really identify these entrepreneurs. one of the challenges that is faced in connecting the large amounts of global capital that want to be flowing to climate finance to those opportunities on the ground is that it is difficult to identify entrepreneurs in all of these countries, and typically smaller entrepreneurs that may be quite young and need a lot of hand-holding to build up to a point where they are able to present a financial pro forma, a business case that could be viable for one of these climate offices or for one of the multilateral banks. And this is where it is so important to work with end-to-end facilities and with networks to bring these entrepreneurs along to that point of financeability, and then to address the fact that most of them are still at a very small ticket size. For many of these entrepreneurs, they're looking for investments on the order of $100,000 to a couple of $100,000 US, maybe when they grow a little bit further, up into the 1 to 2 million, whereas most global finance is looking for ticket sizes at least in the double-digit millions, if not the triple-digit millions. And there is a perception, and this is true, that when you get down to these smaller ticket sizes, there is a higher transaction cost. And that is one of the reasons why public-private partnerships are needed. That higher transaction cost is the cost of doing business and building up the business and building up the climate entrepreneurs out there in these countries. And that's where the public sector can come in and help finance that work with those entrepreneurs to bring them up to the level of investability and then package them together to say, okay, together we have entrepreneurs that add up to a ticket size of 100 million. And they are of this type and this general risk profile. And that then makes something that is more acceptable for 1 or 2 or 3 climate financiers to come in a fund structure working alongside government to de-risk and cover the costs of reaching these many entrepreneurs. But it is only through building up these entrepreneurs that we are going to meet our climate goals. Yeah, so the importance of a climate entrepreneur or a climate thought leader or a climate public policy leader sticking with it is so essential, because we are learning every day as a community, as a global community addressing the climate challenge, how best to address that challenge. And this learning varies from different public policy mechanisms to different private sector mechanisms, including innovative business models. Often innovative business models are fueled by tech innovations. But regardless of where it comes from, these innovations are critical, and working across a network enables us to share that learning from one. So for example, P4G is doing electric mobility work in a number of countries. And what we do when we bring all our stakeholders together is we say, okay, what's working for e-mobility in Kenya? Can that work in Colombia, and vice versa? And the same for the other sectors we're working in. So on the point of grit, when you are starting a new model, no matter what that model is, there are always challenges. And when you are starting a model that is upending previous assumptions about how things ought to be run, or how, let's say, how the electricity grid ought to be managed, a lot of new models in climate are looking at different ways of doing grid management. And what you will find inevitably is that there are barriers. And those barriers may be in the form of people who don't want to or don't understand how to do something. And they may be in the form of straight up technical knowledge okay, how do we adjust that? Can we operate the grid in a new way? And that's where, again, the combined public-private approach is so important to say, okay, this is a problem that government is better equipped to tackle, whereas this is a problem that the private sector is better equipped to tackle. And the only way you come to those solutions is by bringing people together and talking it through and working it through.